following is a production of Cary TV, the Town of Cary's government access channel.
My head.
All right, we're calling to order the meeting for November 27th for the Planning and Zoning Board. We have a very small agenda this evening, so the first thing we will do is discuss that. Does anyone have any changes, any alterations to the agenda? If not, I would look for a motion to adopt our agenda.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor of adopting the agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say no. That motion carries unanimously. Our minutes for the October 23rd meeting are next on the agenda. Would someone make a motion to approve those unless we have changes or alterations? We'd listen to those first. Motion to approve if none.
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
All those in favor of approving the minutes for October 23rd say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed say no. That motion also carries unanimously. We do not have any public hearings this evening, so I'm going to skip the rules for public hearings and go straight to how we administer cases which do not have public hearings. Both of our cases this evening fall into that category. We will have the staff introduce each of those particular cases, one before the other, and then after the staff is done, the applicant will have an opportunity to speak to us for 10 minutes. After the applicant is finished, the board may ask questions of the staff or the applicant, and then we will deliberate and possibly render a decision on each case. That's how we will handle cases without a public hearing. Our first of such is 17 REZ 22. Ms. Bierman's with us this evening. Hello.
Good evening. This is a request by Terramore Homes to rezone a 1-acre parcel located at 4121 Maple Springs Drive. This is an aerial view. The property is located at the northwest of the intersection of White Oak Church Road and Green Level West Road. The existing zoning is Wake County R40 watershed. The proposed zoning district is R12 conditional use with zoning conditions that limit land use to detached dwellings and neighborhood recreation with the maximum density of 2 units per acre. And each lot would contain at least 12,000 square feet with no credit given for any adjacent riparian buffer area. The site is surrounded on 3 sides by property rezoned to R12 CU, the same district earlier this year, by the same applicant, Terramore Homes, and is intended to be a 1-acre extension of that development. The zoning conditions that are proposed here are consistent with the zoning conditions that apply to the area that you see that is already zoned R12 CU. There are no stream buffers or floodways on the site according to Cary's GIS maps. However, final determination of these features is made at the time of development plan review. The site is located approximately 700 feet east of the American Tobacco Trail, which you can see in green. As I mentioned, it will be incorporated into the R12 CU area that has already been zoned, and the development of that combined area will include access to Green Level West Road and White Oak Church Road. The site is in the Green Level Special Planning Area in the Cary Community Plan. It's in Area 3, neighborhoods west of Flat Branch. And this area continues a gradual downward transition in density that moves west from NC 540 towards the Chatham County line, with the aggregate density in this area of not exceeding 2.5 units per acre, and this is generally akin to a contemporary neighborhood. Single-family housing predominates this area, with lot sizes generally 1/4 an acre or larger. There's several policies in the Live and Shape chapters of the Cary Community Plan that are particularly relevant to this request. And these policies generally relate to housing choices, infill and redevelopment, providing appropriate transitions, open space, and neighborhood character. This shows the properties that were notified of the public hearing. There were no area residents in attendance at the neighborhood meeting for this rezoning request. Staff received just one phone call during the process, and that pertained to development opportunities for nearby properties. And staff does recommend approval of this rezoning request. This concludes staff's presentation, and we're available for questions.
Thank you. Is the applicant here to speak with us this evening?
Yes. Good evening, everyone. My name is Neil Ghosh. I'm with the Morningstar Law Group. We're at 421 Fayetteville Street in Raleigh. I want to thank Mary for her presentation. I really don't have a whole lot to add, but did want to let you know that I am here if there are any questions. But essentially, this is a parcel that the applicant was not able to get under contract at the time of initial zoning and has since gotten under contract. And so we're submitting a rezoning that is essentially the same as what has already been approved in this area, which is that R12 CU district you see there. And you know, my recollection is that it was approved unanimously both at this board and by the council when it came up, when the original case came up for consideration. But I'm here to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now open the floor to anyone who has questions of the staff or of the applicant. Anyone on this side?
I don't have any questions.
No? Anyone over here? Well, we all know what comes next then. Would anyone care to make a motion, one way or the other, on this case?
I'll be glad to make a motion. I move that the board forward case number 17 REZ 22 to the town council with a recommendation for approval as it is consistent with the comprehensive plan and all other applicable plans and is reasonable and in the public interest for the reasons discussed.
Have we a second?
I'll second.
Any discussion, Steve?
No, I mean, to me, this is it's pretty cut and dry. It's a continuation of what we've already done. It's gonna, I guess it'll complete this parcel there, and then, it's detached home, so, to me, it fits perfectly with what we've already discussed.
Anything to add?
Steve said everything I would have said.
Anyone else have anything to add to the discussion on this motion? I don't see any high signs from anyone, so I'll call to a vote. All those in favor of 17 REZ 22, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say no, please. That motion carries unanimously. Our second and our final case of this evening is some amendments to the land development ordinance. Ms. Spearman will be with us again this evening. She'll be joined by Kevin Hales of the Planning Department and Lisa Glover from our legal department. Ms. Spearman.
Tonight, we're asking for your recommendation on the Act 2 Land Development Ordinance amendments. As you know, the Land Development Ordinance is an important tool for implementing the Cary Community Plan. Just to spend a little bit of time on that notion, the development regulations that are very critical in the implementation of the plan, they're contained primarily in the Land Development Ordinance. However, there are also other regulations, policies, and guidelines that contribute to creating the built environment. Proposed amendments to all of these are now brought forward as act items. This is a reference to the Act chapter of the Imagine Cary Community Plan. So as we move forward in coming months and coming years, we'll see more and more Act items as we seek to move the community towards the future envisioned by the Cary Community Plan. Tonight, there are 3 LDO amendments before you. Item A concerns commercial parking and would support plan policies that encourage structured parking, and this item will be presented by Kevin Hales. Item B concerns telecommunication facilities. This would align our standards and procedures with recently adopted legislation that's related to small cell wireless facilities, and that item will be presented by Assistant Town Attorney Lisa Glover. And then I will be back for item C. And with that, I'll call on Kevin Hales.
Thank you, Mary, and good evening. Thank you, Mary. Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the P&Z Board. It's been a while since I've had the opportunity to address this body, so. I was asked this evening to talk a little bit about a new amendment to the LDO to change the way we deal with parking overages, especially in relation to provision of structured parking. We've had a growing number of requests for additional parking as businesses and offices change the way they utilize their space, fitting more people in a smaller amount of space. So that's driving up the number of quasi-judicial hearings that are going to council and requiring additional staff time to process. So this amendment will hopefully incentivize structured parking and make more administrative approval possible as it goes through the process. So why do we have commercial parking maximums? First and foremost, easiest one is to reduce impervious surface area. Obviously, structured parking takes up less space than its surface equivalent. Second, to reduce underutilized parking fields, and a good example of that is the Walmart example at Crescent Commons. They've got approximately 795 spaces provided, and this particular image, because it was easy to access from Google, 271 of those spaces were used, which is approximately a 34% utilization rate. They tend to plan for the Christmas rush, which only happens once a year around this time. All parking is not created equal. Traditionally, this is Centrum Shopping Center, and what you see when you see all that extra underutilized parking, which is a wide expanse of asphalt, long rows of parking spaces, and very little landscaping. Every once in a while, they do surface parking a little better out at Weston, an office building where it's got wider medians and a few more landscaping islands. Sometimes we get this. Really what we're trying to get is higher, larger number of structured parking, taking up less impervious and developable land. So let's take a look at a tale of 2 different offices. Buildings currently housing Fidelity Investments and Biologics Incorporated house approximately 260,000 square feet of office space with 1,251 surface parking spaces provided. Adjacent to that, MetLife's campus consists of 2 buildings housing approximately 445,000 square feet of office space with 2,131 parking spaces. Both of them are overparked by approximately 44%. The difference is the surface fields for the first site take up almost 13 acres of the site, while the MetLife parking only takes up 8.5 acres, providing approximately 70% more parking spaces while occupying significantly less surface area. This reduced footprint allows them to fit in a 3rd building, which is currently under development, as well as additional green spaces such as the plaza and amphitheater for their employees. So what are we amending? So today we have a one-size-fits-all approach. Overages of up to 30% are approved administratively. Overages greater than 30% require quasi-judicial hearing and approval through town council. What we're proposing to make that a little easier when you do structured parking is that parking spaces in a structure would not count toward the parking maximum at all, and the parking in the structure would still count toward meeting that parking minimum. So you're not being penalized for putting it in a structure, but you're also making it easier to approve overages when they are structured. That advances several of the goals of the Imagine Cary Community Plan, including providing less impervious surface compared to surface parking, more efficient use of land as our supply of developable land diminishes, and to facilitate office and commercial development by making the process easier to go through and less time intensive. So at the public hearing at Town Council, no citizens spoke. There was some council discussion about unchecked parking overages increasing impervious surface without being weighed in on by council. Staff went back and explored various options for counting some portion of the structured parking toward the maximum. However, all of those were very complicated to administer, and they all came out with estimated or averages, and they were not clear-cut. We feel that the cost of structured parking is 3 to 4 times more than surface parking per space, and it will limit incidents of people just willy-nilly increasing impervious by adding extra parking not needed. So we continue recommending adoption of the original language. And with that, I will turn it over to Ms. Glover to talk about telecommunications small cells. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I know you're not used to me presenting actual items to you like this, but this one is unusual in that it was inspired by recent legislation of the General Assembly. So before we talk about the legislation and the ordinance, let's talk a little bit about small cell technology in case you're not familiar with it. First, to dispel a few myths, small cells did not get their name because they are physically small. Instead, small relates to the area of coverage served by each facility. The facilities can be as tall as a traditional cell tower and have antennae as large as those on a traditional tower. Each installation typically only serves one wireless carrier. AT&T and Sprint, for example, do not share space on these facilities the way they might on a traditional cell tower. So why aren't traditional cell towers enough? According to the wireless industry, small cell facilities are needed to improve poor signals and increase data speeds in hotspots, areas with high concentrations of people. And of course, we're all using our phones and other devices more than ever these days. Mobile data traffic has increased exponentially in recent years and is projected to continue to grow. Internet of Things applications are part of this increase, of course. And the town, with its Smart City initiative to look at smart parking and other things, may also utilize small cell technology. So what does this actually look like? This graphic illustrates the 3 most typical small cell installations. Antennas and their associated power and radio equipment can be installed on existing or new streetlights, existing utility poles, or new standalone poles. In this graphic, the poles are all shown at about the same height. However, pole heights can range from 35 feet for streetlights to over 100 feet for new standalone poles. The antennae are generally located on top of the pole, with radio and power equipment further down on the poles or in a box on the ground, as shown here. We do have one small cell installation in Cary. It's at Davis Drive in Searstone. It was recently installed. And the equipment there is placed on the pole. This keeps bulky equipment out of the right-of-way to lessen potential impacts for pedestrians and vehicles. So the antenna's there at the top, and further down are the radio and power equipment. In this case, the antenna is in a concealed structure. The town has also received applications for replacement of streetlights with new dual-use streetlights that contain small cell technology. Duke Energy has approved this design shown here for replacement streetlights, and it actually comes in 4 colors. We'll talk more about this in a few minutes. We don't have any of these in Cary yet. So now we'll talk about the legislation and the actual LDO amendments. The title of the legislation tells you a lot about its purpose. Reform co-location of small wireless facilities and aid in deployment of new technologies. To those ends, the legislation significantly restricts local government regulation of small cell facilities. The town worked very closely with the League of Municipalities to try to influence this bill. We were successful in procuring some changes that made the bill a bit more palatable, but overall, it is not a good bill for cities. First, the good news. The legislation does not require the town to permit small cell installations on town-owned cell towers, water tanks, or buildings. The new legislation also does not affect existing regulation of traditional privately owned cell towers. Regulation of small cell facilities is now based on location and type of structure. We'll talk briefly now about how that works. The town can no longer regulate small cell installations in NCDOT right-of-way. NCDOT will have sole authority to approve or deny requests for co-location of antennas, or installation of new poles in NCDOT right-of-way. There are 120 miles of NCDOT streets in Cary and nearly 500 miles of town streets. Some of the DOT streets, however, are signature or gateway streets, such as Cary Parkway, Maynard Road, and Carytown Boulevard. New poles installed in the DOT right-of-way can be as tall as any surrounding poles that were in place on July 1st of this year, or can be 50 feet in height, whichever is greater. Antennas co-located on existing poles in DOT right-of-way can be 10 feet taller than the existing pole, or reach 50 feet in height, again, whichever is greater. NCDOT can deny requests that will negatively impact public safety or travel in the right-of-way. It is not clear how NCDOT intends to implement this legislation, and we are not sure at this time if the town will receive notice of new installations in DOT right-of-way. In contrast to facilities located in DOT right-of-way, towns can have some regulations governing installation in town right-of-way or on private property. The legislation does permit regulations that protect public safety, contain objective design standards for utility poles, reasonable stealth and concealment requirements, and screening and spacing requirements for ground-mounted equipment boxes. Towns can also continue to enforce their undergrounding requirements for utilities and similar facilities. So, how have we implemented this limited authority? The LDO amendments propose a new section, 5.2.4H, to govern small cell wireless facilities. In town right-of-way and on private property, new standalone poles are prohibited due to the town's current undergrounding requirements. Existing poles may be replaced with new poles that are capable of supporting small cell wireless installations. This includes the dual-use streetlights. Heights of these replacement poles are limited to 40 feet in areas used for single-family residential purposes and 50 feet elsewhere. The legislation does not permit the town to require poles shorter than that. We propose to limit the height of all antennas to 10 feet above the pole that they are placed on, which is the maximum restriction we can place on height. And we propose requiring all small cell facilities to be stealth or concealed, including the radio and power equipment placed on the poles. Up to this point, we've been talking generically about all sorts of poles or structures that small cell facilities can be placed on. We'll now turn to two specific types of poles that fall outside of this general scheme. The legislation specifically calls out city utility poles, which are defined as town-owned traffic signals, streetlights, and similar facilities located in municipal right-of-way. For these structures, towns must permit co-locations, even if the co-location requires structural upgrades to the traffic signal or complete replacement of the traffic signal. These upgrades must be paid for and constructed by the town at its expense, with reimbursement to be made after the fact. The town is only allowed to charge $50 per pole per year for use of its poles. The picture you see here was taken on a recent council visit to Arizona and shows one type of small cell installation on a traffic signal. Of the 200 or so traffic signals on the Cary system, only 12 are actually owned by the town. These are located downtown and in Weston. The town maintains the other signals on behalf of NCDOT, but we do not own those. The legislation does not require NCDOT to allow co-location on its signals. It's not clear at this time what NCDOT's approach to this issue will be and what sort of notice we may receive if installations are permitted on town-maintained signals. The second unique category of small cell installation is streetlight replacement. Duke Energy and other utilities are required by federal law and regulations to permit co-location of small cell wireless facilities on their existing poles. As noted before, the first and only small cell installation in Cary is located on a Duke Energy utility pole. In addition to their distribution poles and transmission line towers, there are 8,000 streetlights in Cary, owned by Duke Energy, but for which the town pays the maintenance and electricity costs. The existing streetlights in town are generally not structurally capable of supporting small cell co-location. So Duke, together with some small cell wireless infrastructure providers, has developed a replacement streetlight design that has a small cell antenna and its associated equipment. Because of the interest Cary has in its streetlights, Duke requires town consent before allowing a streetlight to be replaced with this new dual-use streetlight. These streetlights could be located on DOT right-of-way, town right-of-way, or even private property. Town staff do have some concerns about replacing existing streetlights with this design, which is heavier and has a deeper foundation than most existing streetlights. For that reason, town staff will object to installations of this design within the clear zone on any public street. The clear zone is the area beyond the main travel way of a road, which is kept clear to allow drivers to regain control of their vehicle if they leave the pavement. Duke is working on a new design that would be a breakaway pole and may be appropriate for placement in the clear zone. So to summarize, the LDO amendments we are bringing forward tonight update terminology and other provisions for traditional cell tower facilities and add a new section specifically for small cell. As written, the LDO amendment takes full advantage of the limited power to regulate that the legislature has provided and requires co-located and concealed small cell facilities. These amendments further policies in the Imagine Cary Community Plan that support provision of high-speed wireless for the town, its residents and businesses, while also preserving and maintaining Cary's attractive appearance. There were no public hearing speakers for this item. Council members expressed concern about the legislation in general and about the provisions regarding city utility poles and access to them by third parties. Since the public hearing, we've made a couple of changes to the ordinance. We've added provisions to address temporary facilities when support structures such as water tanks are undergoing maintenance. And we changed the language to require all antenna co-located on utility poles or streetlights, no matter their location or whether they're a small cell antenna or a traditional antenna, to be stealth or concealed. This time I'll turn it back over to Ms. Bierman.
Thank you.
So the final item, item C, includes two minor technical changes that we're proposing. These are two process-oriented changes. The first would allow zoning conditions in a mixed-use district to include triggers for a quasi-judicial hearing before town council, and this would be an alternative to actually rezoning the entire property for small changes. And the second item would clarify that a champion tree survey must be provided when rezoning to the mixed-use district and shown on the application when it's initially submitted. And that concludes staff's presentation, and we're available for questions.
Thank you. When it comes to the questions for our staff members, let's take items A, B, and C individually so that way they don't have to keep running up and down. So how about item A? I'll start on this side of the room and see if anyone has any questions. That'll, Mr. Varney, got any for
I
parking?
have just a couple. It was a good review there. Could you please go back to that slide of the, was it the tale of two offices or buildings that you described? I think that was very helpful.
I have to find the number.
Great, with all the builds there on it. Perfect, thank you. So I'm just a little curious, since you brought this story up, what was the motivating factor for one to have a much more consolidated parking footprint with, you know, parking structures they are versus the other one? Is it just one was built earlier and one was built later? How did that come about that we have two situations like that?
I can't speak for the motivation of the seller. I can say that one was built significantly earlier, so land values have risen, and the supply of developable land for a large campus like MetLife has dwindled. And so they needed to make better use of that land, and to do so, they have more square footage on there already. They've got almost twice the square footage today, plus another 220,000 square foot going up. So
the only way that they could make it work with the newer development there, MetLife, for the office space they need, and then therefore the parking, was to go multi-structure. That was a choice on their part. That wasn't something imposed by us, by any of our existing ordinances or anything that required that on that space. Is that?
correct. There are no existing ordinances that mandate or require structured parking in any situations. This is an attempt to incentivize that to some extent.
Got it. So we have at this point no ordinances that, in any situation which would require a multi-level parking structure in the town of Cary.
Nothing in the LDO. There may be specific zoning conditions on a particular rezoning or something, but nothing
But
that's,
proposed by the applicant, of course, as they're,
Correct.
as they're building it. Okay, okay. I know there was some question about the trade-off between allowing a higher parking maximum, but also trying to understand how that would be credited towards the maximum number of parking spaces or not as an incentive. But then there was a question about the potential for impervious surfaces that might be potentially improved by favoring a parking structure situation over, again, your tale of two offices. We like less impervious surface than more. But there's nothing there in our ordinances that would accommodate a benefit or an incentive that would additionally motivate a parking structure, because you're going to get the benefit of having a less impervious surface, which could further enhance the motivation perhaps, and maybe mitigate some of the need for stormwater runoff and retention and those sort of mitigating things.
there's currently nothing. This is a small step in the direction of starting to incentivize. The reality is that this ordinance will help people who are already going to build structured parking, but because of the cost difference, 3 or 4 times more expensive per space, it's not going to incentivize somebody to necessarily go out and build a parking deck they weren't already going to do. What it does is it makes it easier process-wise, so it shortens the time frame, so they save money there, and it's a faster process to get the development approved. There is interest, and there will be probably a larger review of parking standards in general. So this is probably a first step, and we will go back and look at this and see how it's working, and then add to it as this goes through as a part of a bigger project later on.
Got it. I understand that there are other municipalities, however, that in the ordinances do have requirements for parking structures, maybe because they're more urban areas like the city of Raleigh, for example. We're just at a level of developing those kind of ordinances that are further behind because we've had more developable space available, and we haven't quite had this pressure on both either the need to get spaces or perhaps the economics of the land to make it. So that's why we may not be able just to jump to those kind of ordinances here in this discussion tonight.
Correct, and this was to solve a particular problem, which has since rectified itself. But this is just a small step in the right direction, see how it works, come back, reevaluate, and then look at it as part of the bigger whole. Because yes, the LDO, I think, in a whole is shifting a slightly different direction as part of the Imagine Cary, but it's going to be a long process.
Do you think this change in our ordinances could have any beneficial impact on the developments being considered and planned for the Cary Town Center or the Fenton development across the street? Would any of this perhaps factor in there to encourage more multi-structure versus multi-level parking as opposed to
It could
traditional
potentially, it is unlikely because they are both going through PDP rezoning, sort of they're already considering and building some of that into their zoning conditions. This is really more for the Regencies of the world, the Westons of the world.
Got it. Okay, thank you. That's all.
Is that it?
I don't really have any questions. I mean, I can see where obviously there's an advantage and you want to make whatever opportunities to encourage people to reduce the impervious surface footprint available. And if these things do help people make a decision in that direction, then I think that's a reasonable solution.
I have no questions.
I have a question. And I kind of understand where we're coming from with the structured parking. One of the things that I'm kind of struggling with, and I know they're probably not going to be able to give me an exact number, but what proportion would you, so one of the driving factors on this is to reduce the number of quasi-judicial hearings for council. What would you say or estimate the proportion of quasi-judicial hearings that involved a parking maximum that also involves structured parking? I mean, is that a big chunk of that, or is it a smaller chunk? And I guess where I'm going with this is I don't really see that much structured parking in Cary to begin with, so I can't see where that many of those quasi-judicial hearings would also involve structured parking.
There have not been a lot so far. There are a few projects, MetLife is one of them, which was handled through the rezoning, but it would have been one of them. There are a couple projects that are currently going on in Regency, an expansion of Regency Creek and Regency Woods 2 office building. This was actually, the LDO amendment was kind of precipitated by that, because if we start seeing more of them, we haven't seen a lot historically, but we're beginning to see more and more. And they're falling right around that 30% overage range. Both of these are 44%. So this is just it's just another carrot that if you provided unstructured parking, we won't make you go through the process of getting the QJ hearing.
Okay, by providing this, do you foresee that there will be more? Because there's now an incentive for developers to put in structured
Well,
parking.
available land is dwindling, so you're going to have, as we change the way we do work, and we put more people in more people in the same space.
Right.
We need to have our parking maximums raised, so we're seeing more requests for QJ parking overages. This would hopefully reduce some of that additional overage request by making it administrative if it's structured, if
Okay.
that makes any sense.
Okay, now I'm following you. But thanks.
Just kind of a comment and a question, just from the comment standpoint, I have a little bit of experience working with surface lots and parking decks, and you're right, a parking deck is really like 5 times the cost of a surface lot, and it also has a lot higher maintenance, just like ongoing maintenance. They're very expensive investment. And what we've found in the past is, I'm only speaking from an office standpoint, not a retail. Most of the parking lot utilization equals the building utilization. If you look at a typical office, people are sick, traveling, working from home, whatever, and that normally equates to the utilization of the parking lot. And most companies are very paranoid that if that day that all their employees actually come into work, or they have a customer event or a community event, then they won't have enough parking. So they tend to take every bit they can get by code.
Sure.
So that one is, I think you're right, it's gonna be really driven by, like with MetLife, they wanted to put a 3rd building over there, they have a small piece of property, and then they wanted to put the amphitheater. I mean, it works for them, but
Sure.
It's a significant expense. You might have mentioned this, and I've just missed it, I'm so sorry. Are you going to count the ground floor in when you do your, you have a stacking of a lot, so how much of that would you think you would count towards the maximum?
The way it's currently written is we will count none of it. And that was one of the concerns council had, is that you could provide 2,000% of your parking overage in structured parking, and none of it would count towards your overage, so it would all be administrative. The reality is the cost is going to prevent you from providing too much additional overage in a structure, because it just doesn't make financial sense. We looked at different ways. We looked at counting the first floor. Well, how do you define first floor? You got ramps and it's all uneven, and where do you break the line? And it starts getting very complicated. There's so many different permutations on structured parking, whether it's podium, standard deck, under a building. I mean, how do you start counting some of that? So just to keep it simple and to thinking it's going to regulate itself anyway due to cost, we just decided to go with the original, or recommend going with the original language, which is don't count any of it. Plus, it kind of incentivizes you to put a deck on top of existing parking, which I think SAS did that out at SAS R's. They just built a deck on top of an existing parking deck, or surface parking.
I mean, that would be a way to do it that would help with offset the investment, which is so steep.
Sure.
Okay, that's it, thanks.
Keep on moving right on. Nothing?
I'm assuming that the LDO already addresses height requirements.
It's considered like any other building, so yes.
You're right. Are we going to allow any flexibility with that as a part of the incentive?
Currently, nothing is proposed. There's already quite a bit of flexibility in regards to the farther you're set back from your required setbacks. In a non-residential zoning district, you get 1 foot of additional height for every additional foot of setback. So some of that's already built in.
Okay. That's all I had.
I have 2 real basic questions, I think. I've always just thought, and I believe I might be mistaken here, that there's an equal amount of quasi-judicial cases where someone is trying to reduce their parking below the minima, or is that not really the case? Is it more, as you said, people would rather have plan to the exception, the Christmas rush, or they're always trying to get more parking than over the max as opposed to less than the min?
We're starting to see more overage requests. Historically, yes, you look at SAS where they have a very strange building utilization because they have a lot of common areas and co-working spaces, and they actually have, everybody has an office, so they have much larger buildings than your other office users sometimes. They have come in and requested reductions consistently. Regency, other users in Weston, what we're hearing from the office development community is they're looking for somewhere around 4.25 spaces per thousand. And our ordinance maxes out at 3.3 spaces per thousand. So we're starting to see as those last pieces in the larger office parks start developing, we're seeing more requests for overages.
Okay. And I understand you said earlier that you're going to be looking at the ordinance on the whole for parking, so I'll just wait to see for a lot of that stuff. But when someone has in the past, are you aware of any instances where a structured parking was, I don't want to say denied, but as designed was not accepted by the town for something other than safety? Are there, if someone comes in with a sensible structured parking, it's probably good to go if all.
None that I'm aware of.
That's all I have.
Typically, structured parking is something that we want people to be investing in, so we.
Pretty basic thing to do. Any other questions? All right, let's move on to item B. I suppose we could take all these in question, just in case item B kicks off someone with a question for A. So we'll hold our motions till the end. So we'll go with item B then. That would be our cell towers. And I'll start on this side of the room this time, and we'll work from right to left.
I don't really have any questions. I think that it was very well presented.
Okay, Ken?
I have a couple questions. Lisa, did you mention that the small cell tower structures are allowed to be up to 100 feet? Or did I miss you?
No, well, we're not going to allow them to be 100 feet. So there have been proposals by companies around the country to install poles as tall as 120 feet. And there have been some installed in other cities, locations around the country. But we would be proposing the 50-foot height limit.
Okay. I guess the other question I have, and this is maybe beyond the town, but who verifies that it's actually small cell technology? I mean, and I don't know enough between what small and big technologies. I get an idea of what the small cell is supposed to do, but I just wonder as technology evolves, the next thing you know, who knows what's on top of that 50-foot pole?
Exactly. So what we will plan to do, and this is evolving as we update procedures and things that you don't see in the LDO in terms of how we handle these applications, is actually having the providers have to tell us, just as with anything someone's building, they have to tell us what they're doing, and we have to trust that they're telling us the truth about what they're installing. So we will be asking them, what are you building? Is it small cell? Is it not small cell? Are there any other federal laws that you claim to have rights under that would entitle you to something? So we're going to be asking the applicants to tell us what is it that they're building and what sort of rights are they claiming so that we could process applications from there. We don't necessarily have the expertise in-house to evaluate it, and if it's in a concealed structure like this, we don't know what's inside that necessarily. And as new technologies come along, we'll just have to try to keep up with that.
I guess one other follow-up question on that is, and it may not be a good answer, it may not be even germane to this, but in the DOT right away, I guess it's the General Assembly who'll regulate as to what can and can't go in those right of ways. I mean, I'm trying to think of, if General Assembly decided that they were going to allow 100-foot.
They could say
structure.
that for DOT. They could mandate that DOT allow that. Right now, they've written it in a way that DOT has some discretion, and they haven't put. They have allowed sort of minimum heights. They haven't said they can be up to 100 feet tall, but they've said they can be at least 50 feet tall in DOT right-of-way.
Okay.
But DOT has some discretion to look at safety, placement of the pole, that sort of thing, and make sure it's in a location they feel is safe for the public. But ultimately, yes, the General Assembly controls DOT and the towns with what we can approve, but they've left some things to DOT to figure out on their own.
Well, I hope that common sense prevails. We don't see something like billboards, decisions being made driven, like we saw with billboards, and somebody decided that, 100-foot poles would be a really great thing to do on Cary Parkway,
Right.
But anyways, enough. I'm done.
Just a comment, the picture that we're looking at now, this is an example of a standalone.
This was an
Small.
existing Duke utility pole. So you see the wires kind of
Yep,
going
yep,
across the
yep.
street. So the company added the piece at the top and the piece kind of in the middle that I had circled earlier. So the small cell pieces are the piece at the very top, and couple little boxes you see there.
And these are singles, so this could, I'm just making this up, this could be AT&T. And then on the next
Right.
pole over it could be Verizon and so
Right.
forth.
Right. They don't, as I understand it, they don't want to, structurally, this pole probably couldn't support anything else other than what they put on it here. So that's one reason why there's one carrier per pole. And then I think for other reasons, they don't necessarily want to share space.
So in areas that have underground utilities, then that would yield to more towards a what? You know, if you don't have these poles available,
Right.
what would they, yeah, because, you know, they're going to have to really get creative.
Potentially the replacement streetlights. So even in places where we don't have utility poles, we may have streetlights. And of course, they always have the option to look to private property to install these devices. They can attach to buildings and other things on private property. As far as the right-of-way is concerned, we would like to prohibit new poles in the right-of-way, but they could, where we can, of course we can in DOT right-of-way, but where we can limit it, we'd like to limit it, and then the streetlights would be one option for folks.
Yeah, that to me, in at least a lot of Cary, I would anticipate, unfortunately, there are going to be a lot of streetlights replaced.
And so far, we have had about a dozen applications for streetlight replacement. None have been processed and approved. They're being processed, none have been approved yet for various reasons. So we haven't seen a flood of it yet. We'll just have to wait and see.
Okay, thanks.
So I have a couple questions, Lisa. So walking through kind of a hypothetical here, I have underground utilities in my neighborhood. Let's pretend I want to lease part of my private property out to Sprint to put a 50-foot pole in there. What are the requirements that would fall, or maybe my neighbor wants to do that? What would the requirements be given that? A situation where it's in the private property outside of the right-of-way?
This ordinance would prohibit that,
Okay, so that would not be,
right,
Okay.
on single-family property.
okay, perfect. I like the inclusion of the stealth and concealed requirement. Can you maybe elaborate or detail exactly how that's going to work out? I guess I see a picture of a 50-foot pole and a 10-foot antenna on top of that. How exactly is that going to be concealed?
So this picture that's on the screen, the antenna at the top is concealed because you don't see the spindly, stick kind of antenna thing. Best I could describe it. Now on this one, because this was our first, the box, and if I can get to the one where I have it circled, looks like it's 39. So at the top, that's the antenna, and that's fairly concealed, although I think we can require a little bit more from them. The things that are circled lower down, those are actually not concealed as we would envision it for future installations. There's and I don't have a great picture of it here, but they can kind of shroud them so they're in a little more plain kind of structure so that you don't see, like on this one, you can kind of see the vents on the radio equipment. So that would be a little more shrouded than this installation is here. So we would expect future installations to be a little more concealed than this one is when they're installed on an existing pole. And of course, with the street lights, everything's there. The antenna is at the top in that kind of, cylindrical thing. And you see the box, there's a parking, a parking meter there. The silver thing is not part of the dual-use street light, that's a parking device. But the black box on the pole is where their radio and power equipment are. So we would expect the dual-use street lights, this is the Duke design. And then for the kind of the box that's on here, the black rectangular box, is the more shrouded of what we would expect even on existing utility poles. It would look more like this than the previous picture.
Okay, gotcha. And my last question is around review and compliance. The way this sounds, there's going to be a lot of these, or there's a potential to be a lot of these. How does staff plan to go about ensuring compliance and conducting reviews on these on the scale of the entire town?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know if Mr. Hales wants to speak specifically. He has reviewed some of these. They have to file applications. We are limited. There's discussion in the staff report, I believe, about the limits that we have on charging review fees, which are very much reduced from what we would typically charge for review. So that's an issue. But they do have to file applications for anything that's on town right-of-way or private property. DOT right-of-way, you may not see. But town right-of-way and private property, they'll file applications. Staff will review those. They've got a short time frame to do that, but they will process and review those. And then as for after the fact compliance. I don't know if Mr. Hales wants to speak to that and how we may kind of keep tabs on that.
I only have one example so far, so I don't have a whole lot of information. Basically, all these timeframes are mandated by the statutes, so these get slotted in with everything else, and they just get reviewed, and we make do, and other things get delayed. For compliance, we do have a building permit because they do require electrical in most cases. Because of that, there's something to tie an inspection to. We just make sure that when that gets set up, we schedule a site inspection. The site inspector goes out and says, yes, it looks like the concealed antenna up at the top in the boxes, and that's how that works, just like anything else. So
Okay.
we're using existing processes, just slotting them in with the other workflow and managing our, we set up new systems in the review to manage the scheduling.
Okay, so compliance would be done more like a building compliance versus a zoning compliance? Is that how I'm
Well, it's
interpreting
done,
that?
it's the
Is it
same
actually
site
like
inspection,
visiting
it's
it?
done by the planning department, so our site
Right.
inspectors go out and look at it, just like any other building permit.
Okay. All right, thanks. Yep.
Chuck?
If these things become abandoned at some point in the future as technology changes, do we have any way to recover cost for, we want to remove them from the pole and either penalize people who don't take them down in 180 days or do a cost recovery for the actual cost of taking them down?
Well, the legislation is interesting in that regard. For the actual co-location of antennas, like this example on Davis Drive, if we figure out that it's been abandoned, which may be hard to do by looking at it, if we figure that out, we can order them to remove it within 180 days, and if they don't, we can do it ourselves and go after them for cost recovery. So that's available to us, but you know, I don't know how likely it is in practice that we would do that. What's interesting about the legislation is if someone is permitted to put up a new standalone pole, the legislation does not actually provide any means where the city could remove an abandoned pole. So that's just kind of a quirk in the legislation that wasn't drafted very well. But there is provision in there for removal of antennas that have been abandoned. But again, there's also provision in there that if we approach the company and say, this has been abandoned, you have 180 days to remove it. If they say, well, we're getting ready to start using it again, then we have to back off. So there's some provision in there, but it's not very friendly to cities to actually be able to get things removed.
Okay, would it be helpful to have any specific penalty language in the ordinance?
We're not permitted to do that.
So you stand by there with your cell phone to see if you got a good signal or not?
I guess that's how you do it.
Assuming you know which provider.
Yeah.
Anything else? Hey, Joe, you got anything?
I see on here, one of the options is to put these things inside of buildings and venues. So how
Yes.
exactly would that attach? It seems like these are, in my simple mind, I just assume they need that outside exposure to be able to generate a signal.
It would be generally to the exterior. We have had carriers approach us in terms of placing antennas at Coca Booth Amphitheater under the crescent. We haven't thought that was such a great idea. But that is an area of high utilization when there's a big concert or event. So far, we haven't found a way that we think would work for us from an aesthetic standpoint, and we have control over that venue and can say yes or no. But at big sports stadiums, there are pictures on the internet, if you Google, of some big sports stadiums where there are small cell installations, generally, you know, on the exterior or in an open air stadium, could be more in the interior, and that's to provide coverage for those large events.
Interesting. Okay, that's all I got.
Hi, that was a good review, thank you very much. Just clarification, I actually dumped out, printed out the HB 310 regulations here, and it's interesting, could you just clarify this exclusion regarding single-family residential property? It seemed a little unclear about what they were trying to preclude, the co-location of small wireless infrastructure or some different interpretation of what the regulations or oversight that the town of Cary might have in single-family residential areas. Can you explain?
What it appears to me that they're doing is permitting towns to regulate more stringently on property that's used for single-family residential purposes.
Okay, that's sort of how I interpreted. So
Yes.
they set all these light touch rules for basically everything except
Except-
NCDOT controlled roads.
Right.
And then just about everything else except single-family residential. So somehow, because we've been given, but it's not clear, we have more jurisdiction or more power in single-family residential areas.
Correct.
Correct? It's not precluding them in single-family residential. It just, I guess, because they didn't say anything otherwise, we
Right.
presume
The
we have
town,
more
so
discretion.
different towns can enact ordinances to implement this authority in different ways. We've taken the position that we want to, from an aesthetic standpoint, we want to limit the height and the look of these facilities. We still want them in Cary. We all need them. We all use our cell phones. So we're taking, though, the strongest position that the legislation allows in terms of limiting the height and limiting where they can be placed. But other cities could choose to say they're permitted on single-family residential property. The height can be 60, 70, 80 feet. You know, other cities can choose to go a different way with that. But we're taking the most stringent view of the regulations that we think we can do under the law.
So in our proposed ordinance change here, are we then, because we have a little more discretion over single-family residential areas, we are choosing to preclude co-location in those situations?
Yes.
Okay, because we do have a lot of street lights that may be in those areas, and in some of these areas, some areas that have not undergrounded, there may be utility poles going through single-family residential areas that could be candidates for these devices, these services. Our view is we're not going to allow them in any single-family residential situation.
Right, at this time. Existing poles can be replaced with existing streetlights that are typically in the right-of-way, occasionally can be on private property, can be replaced with a dual-use streetlight. So streetlights going through a residential neighborhood could be one avenue for installation of technology. But at this time, you know, we don't see the need to impinge any more on single-family residential property than we have to.
So the town of Cary's view here is that for single-family residential areas, whether it's an existing utility pole, which may be in that neighborhood or on the periphery of it, or a street light that may be in that area, even if the wiring is otherwise, utilities are otherwise undergrounded, we're going to not allow that because HB 310 gives us more discretion in single-family residential areas. We're going to just say no at this point to any consideration.
At this point, we're trying to be as protective of single-family as we can.
And so then how does that affect utility poles that might be running around the periphery of a neighborhood with utility service or existing electrical cable and things like that, not light? Those run around a number of our older neighborhoods here in town. Would that exclusion then of include those existing utility poles that are privately owned by a utility company? It would be precluded on those as well.
I'm going back to the ordinance to make sure I tell you correctly. And seeing if I can find it. So, in our new section of the ordinance that we've created, we are prohibiting co-location on lands used as single-family residential property unless it's replacement of a streetlight with the dual-use facility. So the only co-location permitted on the single-family residential property, so not the right-of-way, but actually on a lot, would be replacement of a streetlight with a dual-use streetlight. So utility poles that are not on the lot, that are in the right-of-way, would be subject to co-location. But if the pole is actually on a lot and not within official right-of-way, the only thing we're allowing is the replacement with a dual-use streetlight design.
Okay, so we will allow that within a residential area. And many of those neighborhoods which may have already pre-existing undergrounded utilities, of course, they only have a street light that can't be undergrounded for obvious reasons.
Right.
So in that situation, we will allow in single-family neighborhoods those streetlights to be modified by a service provider. But they'll have to have the permission of the property owner or perhaps the HOA of a neighborhood or something like that.
Depending on the property interest involved,
Because
yes.
those streetlights would not normally be something the town of Cary owns, as we counted 8,000 that Duke Energy runs for the town of Cary. Those 8,000 didn't include those things within neighborhoods and subdivisions.
Yes, I believe it does.
It does? It
Thank
does
you.
include all of
Yes.
those too?
Yes, that's
Okay,
in
so
the
within-
8,000, yes.
So that's an aggregate number overall.
Yes.
So we would allow that. Okay.
Yes. And again, the utility poles and things, if they're in the right-of-way, then they can co-locate on those, as we say in the ordinance. It's only, the single-family prohibition is only for actual on a single-family lot. So the neighborhood itself is going to have lots of right-of-way within it that may have things in the right-of-way that could be potential for co-location. But the single-family lot itself is what we're trying to protect.
Well, some developments have buffers and so forth around them that are outside the homeowner's property, but, for the buffers, the HOA may maintain those. There may be where utility poles are.
And that would not be subject to the prohibition. The only thing the legislation allows us to protect is the land that's used for single-family purposes.
Okay, okay. So, we could certainly run into situations then where in some neighborhoods, a street light could be converted into one of these things. And with some neighborhoods where we have very high density, which would probably be ideal for some of these small cell technologies anyway, because the homes may be very, very close together, and they're very short distance between a home to a street. I know neighborhoods which fit this situation, there are only street lights, and some of the street lights no more than 20 feet from the front door, and because of the height, they're just right at second bedroom level. And there's where, a tower with a wireless technology is going to start beaming around that area. So we can't, with FCC rules and such, we can't
Right.
regulate on those sorts of things. I understand that, but that's certainly a scenario that could occur here. Why wouldn't we just eliminate that as well if our jurisdiction says within single-family residential areas, we preclude as well even the streetlight changes to accommodate?
We could do that. Sometimes the streetlights typically streetlights are in right-of-way. Sometimes they are located just behind the right-of-way, so within about a 3-foot strip behind the right-of-way in a utility easement. So given that that's not prominent, it's not prevalent, it's not every streetlight, but there are some that way, we just felt like it would be worth it in terms of, we're trying to incentivize the streetlight co-location replacement because it is a more stealth installation than the other kind. And so to an extent, it's a way to, again, incentivize the streetlight replacement because it's relatively benign of the choices we have from an aesthetic standpoint. It's obviously, any of this can be revisited in the future as legislation allows us to revisit it. So if we find for some reason that that's not working or there's objections to it, it's something we could look at in the future.
And just one other question. In the 12, I think the number was 12, town of Cary owned light traffic signals, streetlights, what have you, that we own. If a wireless carrier were to approach us to get a permit to be having something installed there, may even entail a cost on the part of the town of Cary to, retrofit, which I believe they would have to reimburse for making ready. If there would be a situation where another carrier were to approach us and say, that's a great spot for my service, I want to be a competitor to service A that just installed, are we obliged to have competitor B, C, and D also mounted on that same tower and go back and retrofit over and over and over? I mean, is there a limitation
Probably.
to that? There's no limitation.
If they can engineer it, they can do it.
And you'll have to and the town of Cary will have to make it ready.
Yes.
Got it, got it. And just one on those same towers, if there'd be an unfortunate situation where maybe an accident, someone drives into one of those light things, they fall down, terrible weather, storm, one of those falls down, there's no mention here of what the municipality's liability potentially might be in that sort of a situation with regard to, for the service provider, they lose their service, equipment may be damaged, they may not be able to continue to run their service to generate revenues for some period of time. Is there some notion of any kind of indemnification to the municipality, in this case town of Cary, in that kind of situation where perhaps by no fault of the town of Cary, the tower was disrupted and services could no longer continue?
Right, or if someone obviously was hurt when it fell over. It's not in the legislation. What the legislation does say is that if someone approaches us to locate on a traffic signal, we then have 60 days to work out an agreement with them. So we would expect to have basically a contract that sets out some of those roles and responsibilities, but we would have to negotiate that and see what we could negotiate with the carriers in terms of responsibility for those sorts of things.
So do we have a goal then in that regard to seek in that negotiation to preserve some level of indemnification for the town?
Absolutely.
In regard to if something happens, act of God, weather, whatever, we're not exposed to all sorts of extra cost or?
We would seek to have that sort of language in any agreement.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
I'm sorry.
Go right ahead.
Just to piggyback off what Victor was saying, I understand that he was asking about act of God or weather or what have you. What about the regular maintenance? Because as it's up there for a year or two, I mean, I'm assuming that it's going to be made of some type of metal, and going through the weather and stuff, I don't want it to become an eyesore on a pole.
Right.
So is there anything in the legislation or anything that we're planning on putting in our agreement with this carrier that they have to maintain a certain level of standard?
So the only area that we could have control over that would be the traffic signal installation. So that's going to be very limited. That would be only the 12 signals. But in that agreement, we could attempt to negotiate language like that. For the other installations around town, the ones that look more like this, we can't, as I read the legislation, we can't require a minimum level of maintenance on those. So, you know, we can encourage it. And in fact, under the legislation, we cannot require a permit for any maintenance or replacement in kind of equipment. So there at least is, I don't know if you call it incentive, but there's no penalty for them to maintain their equipment and to replace it, you know, with something that maybe functions better, something of the same, you know, size, general thing like that, they can replace without coming in for a permit or for a review. But that's all that the legislation permits.
So if it's on a street pole, excuse me, if it's on a street pole, then somebody in that neighborhood or that views that would have to contact that carrier and file a complaint. There's nothing that the town of Cary could do in that situation, correct?
That's most likely correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else?
I got one, two quick follow-up questions. On respective to single-family property on the lot itself, if somebody has, and if I understood what you said before, if somebody has an existing light pole, somebody has paid for a street light on their property for the utility company, could they replace that pole with a small cell, basically?
They could replace it with this.
They could replace it with that. So if they wanted to take their existing pole, the street light that's, that they have on their personal, they could replace it with that, okay.
They could, now it would, because the town is involved with paying for these streetlights with Duke, that would come to us to consent to. So if there was some safety or other reason why we thought that wasn't appropriate, you know, we could talk with folks about that. But in general,
Okay.
yes.
All right. I know that talking on the edges, the likelihood of somebody doing that. And just for clarification, with, let's call it large cell towers versus
Right.
small cell, does the town require a decommissioning fee or any consideration for decommissioning on those? I understand that with the small cell, we can't, but do we consider that any?
I don't think we have anything.
No.
No, I don't think we
I'm
have anything in the
just
ordinance
curious.
now about that.
All right, thank you. I'm done.
Well, I'll just throw my couple little questions in here. Technology being what it is, tomorrow's technology could be completely different. Nobody knows. But right now, the plan is that these small cells are to augment the large cell towers, not eventually replace them.
Well, there's discussion about that. Right now, you hear the carriers say it's to augment, but we know of carriers who are coming down from high sites. They're coming off the traditional towers, and I think they're trying to move towards, and you see some of it in the press about this industry, that are moving towards small cells and moving off of traditional towers for financial reasons.
And that's what I understand, that there are companies out there that are using just small cells and not the real tall ones.
Well, if I may add, as we evolve to our next cellular technology, 5G, it is inherently very small cell friendly. And so that's a big motivator for what's going on here with a lot of service providers getting ready for 5G. The other important factor is also going on is the whole notion of wireless broadband. So we now are excited about broadband over fiber coming to our neighborhoods and tearing up the streets, blah, 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 whatever. For service providers, as new capabilities develop with fiber or with wireless broadband technologies, they could actually deliver the same sort of service or even better without the need for fiber through wireless technologies. And many of those would also be small cell. So those things are very important and coming down the pike very, very quickly for us. Not to mention even other technologies around things like the whole area of digital short-range communication related to communication between traffic lights and things like that in cars, vehicle to infrastructure type of communications. It's a whole other thing being driven by the US DOT. So all those things are going to want to find a place on a light pole, on a traffic light, whatever. And they're often going to be coexisting because they're going to be provided by different service providers, and they're going to be different technologies. So, these things could look like, Christmas trees with all kinds of things hung on them over some period of time based on all of these things that are rolling down, which is where I have concerns about quite where that's going. But the state of North Carolina has precluded municipalities from having a lot to say one way or the other about that, except for single-family neighborhoods.
Well, it sounds like it's going to get me more Eagles games, so I'm not stuck watching the Panthers all the time, so I'm okay with that. But
That's about right.
the cell towers, a couple of months ago, we had a case where there's a cell tower on an existing property, and there were some considerations about how far you have to be away. All those considerations are tower-oriented, not what's ever hanging on the tower, correct?
Well, this legislation complicates things a little bit. Whatever fits into the definition of small cell technology, as they defined it in the legislation, gets to have this special treatment. There could be a small cell on top of a large tower, but in general, our tower ordinance, we've made some kind of cosmetic changes to it, updated some terminology and things, if you've seen in the attachment. In general, they haven't changed the rules about traditional towers at this point in time. So all of our rules about setbacks and other requirements that we haven't had to change anything on that.
Good thing. And Victor touched on this earlier, but the whole idea of, I guess Duke would be more to deal with this, but we're kind of out of the whole one multi-use street light carries carrier A, and then the very next carrier, the very next street light is optioned by that same carrier to prevent the other. That's all out of our hair. We don't deal with any of that nonsense, correct?
Yeah, generally Duke is going to have to deal with that. They approach Duke. They need to work out their deal with Duke first before they come to us. So
Okay.
they work with Duke first to see where locations might work, and then we would get the request from Duke to consent.
My second biggest thing that got me nervous was the word reasonable. I saw it twice.
That's straight from the statute.
This is brand new stuff, and except for maybe what we saw in Arizona, I mean, reasonable maybe hasn't been put up yet as far as stealth, and as far as I think the other consideration was for undergrounding maybe. But is it conceivable someone could come in with something that we don't consider reasonable, that they consider reasonable, and because this is so brand new, we're going to let who would decide that then?
The courts. We have no definition of reasonable, and obviously we have no court cases at this point. It's brand new legislation, but there could be a situation sometime. And the challenge would be, is our requirement reasonable? And of course, the carrier that doesn't like a decision we make would argue that wasn't reasonable, and that would be our court case.
So it'd be the court, not the legislature.
Well, the legislature could come back, and they can always amend legislation.
Oh, okay.
So that's another alternative, but the initial fight would probably be a court case.
That was the thing that had me the most nervous until we talked more about this single-family thing. And I was just thinking about a case we had a couple of cycles back. There was a lot with a single-family detached on it. Maybe I'm missing the nuance of detached, that someone wanted to put some townhomes on. Is it conceivable we could have a public hearing with a whole pile of people lined up here saying, if you keep this zoned single-family detached, everything's fine. If you zone this and put that fourplex on there, they can then put a 100-foot tower in because it's not a single-family property and it can beam God knows what at all. Can we hear that? Is that possible?
So single family is also not defined in the statute. But what I would say is anything on a separate lot, townhomes are separately platted on lots. So each townhome is a single-family residential property. So I think a townhome versus a detached single-family we're going to treat it the same under this ordinance. Those are both single-family properties. Now, apartment buildings, condos potentially would be a different situation, but I think townhomes would be treated the same as detached single-family.
They may want to put those on the building if it's an apartment too. Might
Right.
actually work. Okay, that's all the questions I had. Thank you for answering those very much. Anyone else have any other questions for B? Yes.
One observation, the thing that you were most scared of in law school was having the professor stand you up for 45 minutes, asking you questions. She must have done very well in law school.
Thank you, sir.
Nicely done, thank you. If no one has any more questions for Ms. Glover, we'll move on to C, the technical amendments, and invite Ms. Bierman back. Start on this side, I guess. We're back and forth. Anyone on the technical questions?
No questions on item C.
Mary Jo, anything from you?
I don't have anything.
We'll just keep on sliding down to the right. Anyone? I guess these are just essentially, once again, as Ryan said earlier, to reduce the amount of quasi-judicial hearings we have to go through and sort of make some of these decisions on the front end so we don't have to go through a quasi-judicial on the back end. Is that the gist of?
These items don't really, are a different issue. Actually, the first item could potentially allow more quasi-judicial. It goes the opposite direction. However, that would be as an alternative to going through an entire rezoning case. So it's a balance off with the time factor in getting to a decision.
So in that case, it would be more expedient to.
It would be more expedient in that case and more efficient to go quasi-judicial, and it would at least, it would give the applicant for mixed-use district cases the option to incorporate that into their request. And then the second one with the Champion Tree Survey, is just simply providing more, make sure we have enough information up front to avoid quasi-judicial in the future in that case, because we would be making sure that the Champion Tree issues are addressed up front on a preliminary development plan so that we don't catch that later and end up having to redo a plan in order to accommodate the tree, and then that would have to go to quasi-judicial.
That makes good sense. Thank you. Any questions at all on A, B, or C lingering out there? Is there anyone who plans to vote differently on A, B, and C, or A, B, or C?
Could I don't think I would vote differently, but I do want to offer maybe one tweak to item B.
By all means.
Okay? It would be my proposal that that while the intent of what the state of North Carolina wants to do with regard to small cell technology is I see actually as being very admirable. It does create challenges for municipalities to accommodate it, but I completely agree with the direction. But where the state of North Carolina has given us discretion at this time to choose how we want to regulate or deploy or accommodate at this point in time, or maybe some point in the future, single-family residential deployments, I would really encourage that we actually think of not approving that for single-family residences this time, and especially with the uncertainty yet to be done with the, as you know, the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, is still working with regard to their 5G technology and deployment standards, which may include a number of things. Of course, we won't be able to be involved in regulating it all, but may include some things that do describe what distances are, like currently cellular technology, what we're familiar with, has certain distance buffer requirements for where you might want to have residential to a tower, and certain height, whatever, and all those things are basically set in place and they've been handed down from the FCC. Until those regulations have been cast in stone, and we're certain about that, because that is going to be one important small cell technology, I think we should take a little bit of pause in time to learn about those things. I think we should also perhaps see how this technology evolves in non-single-family residential areas and see how poles get deployed and how other carriers do and blah, blah, blah. And then at some point, when we have a little more information, then we can make a determination whether we'd like to permit in some form certain things to be done in single-family residential areas, whatever that may be, street poles or anything else. I just would encourage that we, since we do have that discretion, just to take a pause on that, which we're allowed to do with the North Carolina regulation here, to get more information, and particularly with regard to the FCC decisions on 5G.
So are you proposing, let's just take B while we're talking about it. Are you proposing
a modification to B?
A modification or amendment?
Which, as Ms. Glover explained, we're choosing at this time to allow single-family residential deployments of small cell technology on street lights. And that could be arranged with a new street light or however they want to modify it. I would just suggest at this time we put a hold on anything in single-family residential areas until such time as we perhaps gathered more information. I don't think that's going to compromise anything else. Everything else goes, and of course, we're mandated by the state of North Carolina what we need to do everywhere else. But while we have that discretion to decide how we want to do it in the town of Cary, particularly in single-family residential areas, I don't know that we're being motivated and driven to decide right now to start saying okay to anything.
So just for the sake of brevity and to wrap it up in something we can put in the minutes, you're proposing that we not permit any of these uses.
Small cell technology, co-location, what have you, in single-family residential areas.
Neighborhoods.
That's right.
Including right-of-ways.
Well, in single-family residential areas, along the streets or on the private property owner's property, whatever, but in single-family residential areas where it's allowed, we're just not going to open the gates on that at this time.
So is that captured well enough, single-family
I think
areas?
so.
Okay.
Just to clarify, so we can't prohibit it in the right-of-way. So the right-of-way within the neighborhoods, we are regulating it to the maximum extent we can under the legislation. The only place where we could potentially regulate more, we are allowing street light replacement on residentially zoned property, essentially. We could prohibit street light replacement, that would, on residential lots. That would be the one additional thing we could do that we aren't doing at this point in time.
Because in many neighborhoods which we've already undergrounded utilities, the only thing they have are the streetlights. And so because of the density in some of these neighborhoods, they're going to be potentially prime candidates for service providers to provide signals so you can watch the game you just described. And because of that motivation, I appreciate that's going to be a desirable target for these small services to be deployed. But since we're not motivated, exactly as you described it, I would not allow at this time the provision for accommodation on streetlights in those residential areas.
So probably, I'm going to guess, and I know the percentage will be wrong, but it's a high percentage, 90, 95%, perhaps more, of streetlights are in the right-of-way. So your amendment would only affect potentially 5% of streetlights. So in a residential neighborhood where the streetlight is in the right-of-way, we essentially have to permit co-location in that instance. So what you're proposing would affect a very small, just to be clear, we can't prohibit it entirely within a neighborhood if it's a streetlight is within the right-of-way.
And that's because of the state statute.
Right.
So are you okay then with a provision that says that, or amend the LDO to not permit any uses on residential zoned property?
Because we do have neighborhoods here that the streetlights are sitting and they may have an easement sitting in the property owner's front yard. We have some neighborhoods which are so dense and compact, and that's where I have the highest concern, because where that situation is where it's 20 feet from the front door to the street and there's a light pole right between there and the house, those are areas that are going to be perhaps both desirable for services to be deployed, but I think also would benefit most from better understanding of what the FCC rules ultimately are on 5G.
I think what Lisa is saying, that we could do that, but as long as we stipulate that it's not in the right of way, because you can't, according to the legislation, prohibit if it's in the right of way.
And most public streets in Cary are going to have a right-of-way 5 feet back of the curb.
Right. And I'm not sure if we've got we have, I don't know if I want to put Mr. Kondo on the spot, or if he knows, or if Mr. Hales knows. We've had discussions about this internally as staff, and I am not the expert, but there are limited circumstances where roads have been built, and for various reasons, the street light is not technically within the right-of-way. It's within an easement on private property. Again, that's not typical. It's pretty rare, but it has happened. And because of that, and partly to simplify administration of the ordinance, and having to figure out exactly, is the street light in the right-of-way, is it on private property? For ease of administration, and again, to appear reasonable, we would like, we've proposed to allow the street light replacement regardless of where the street light is located. Again, because typically, if it's right behind the right-of-way, if it's not in the right-of-way, so it wouldn't be 10 feet back of the right-of-way, it would be just outside the right-of-way if it's not technically in the right-of-way. So from our standpoint, that was the impetus for permitting the street light replacement, even if located off of the right-of-way. You know, I see Mr. Varney's point, and if the board is so inclined, you know, that recommendation could be forwarded with your recommendation to council, and staff could further evaluate.
Does everyone here understand the limitations of what Victor's proposing? Because if so, we wouldn't have to restate the whole thing. Do you want to make that motion with that, only for item B with that proviso in there?
Can we pull A and C out and vote on those first?
Sure we
And then
can.
come back to B?
We can do A and C out. I think everyone kind of feels the same way on A and C. Someone want to do A and C together? Anybody?
Since I suggested it, I guess
Yeah,
I'll do
you
it.
Had the cheat sheet ready to go.
All right. I move that the board forward LDO Amendment 17 Act 02 to Town Council with a recommendation for approval, as it is consistent with the comprehensive plan and all other applicable plans, and is reasonable and in the public interest for the reasons discussed, and this is pertaining to items A and C.
Is there a second on that?
Second.
Any discussion on A and C? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say no. A and C are passed unanimously. We're back with B. Thank you. So on that provision, I just want to make sure we have it clearly laid out, so it,
So I would move that the board forward case, help me,
17 Act 02.
17 Act dash 02, to Town Council, a recommendation of approval as consistent with the comprehensive plan and all their applicable plans, as reasonable and in the public interest for reasons discussed, with a change, with it changed only to preclude at this time any small tower or small cell services being deployed within any single-family residential properties.
sound okay to everyone? Is there a second on that?
Does it need clarification
Well, I just
except
wanted-
right-of-way?
Well, no, so I think as I understand it, then you all would be forwarding item B to council with a recommendation for approval, with the recommendation that the provision for streetlights on single-family residential property be removed.
Yes.
And so that would be your recommendation.
Sound right? Still seconding?
Sure, yes.
Okay. Any more discussion you want to have on that thing? Anybody else? Okay, all those in favor of item B with the change as currently in the motion, please say aye, and put your hand up. I think this might not be.
Aye?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say no?
No?
No, 2 noes. Okay. 1, 2, 3. 5. All right, great. So it passes. And I think we're all covered on that. We're good. Thank you very much for the three of you getting up there with us on that. It was quite more involved than I thought it would be. So anyhow, I think that ends our agenda for this evening, unless there is any old or new business. No one having any? The next motion is the motion to pack it in.
I'm making a motion to adjourn tonight's meeting.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor of adjournment say aye.
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 That passes unanimously. We are adjourned. Thank you very much and good evening.
This has been a production of Cary TV. Visit the Town of Cary's website at townofcary.org.